In the ancient days of Israel, when the judges ruled, something happened that would forever change the story of one family. This isn't just a story of loss and sorrow, but one of choices, loyalty, and a love that crossed boundaries. It's the story of a foreign woman named Ruth, who left everything she knew behind to follow her mother-in-law to an unknown land. A story that shows us how God works through even the most difficult circumstances to carry out his greater plans. Let's go back in time and meet this family from Bethlehem who, fleeing hunger, found more than they ever expected in a foreign land. And let's discover how a young Moabite woman became a vital part of God's people's story. The book of Ruth opens in hard times. As Ruth 1:1 says, "In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab." Ironically, Bethlehem, whose name means house of bread, had no food. So a man named Elimelech decided he had to protect his family. Elimelech didn't make that decision lightly. The famine in Israel was severe, and many were suffering. He looked at his wife Naomi and their 2 young sons, Mahlon and Chilion, and knew he had to act. Packing their belongings and leaving their homeland was painful, but necessary for survival. The journey wasn't easy. From the hill country of Judah, the family traveled east, crossing the Dead Sea into the highlands of Moab. It was a foreign land with foreign people, different customs, and more importantly, different gods. The Moabites were traditionally enemies of Israel, descendants of Moab, the child born from Lot's incestuous relationship with his eldest daughter. But hunger left Elimelech with no choice. They went to Moab and lived there, continues verse 2. It was meant to be temporary, just until the famine in Judah passed. They settled there as foreigners in a strange land. Elimelech worked hard to support his family while Naomi raised the boys, teaching them the traditions of their people, even in exile. Years went by. Mahlon and Chilion grew up strong in Moab. They learned the local language, made friends among the Moabites, and adapted to their new life. Then something unexpected happened. As verse 3 tells us, now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. Elimelech's death changed everything. Suddenly, Naomi was a widowed foreigner in a land not her own. Her sons, now grown, became the family's providers. It was a time of grief and adjustment. Naomi deeply felt the loss of her husband, but found comfort in her sons, who now cared for her. As time passed, Mahlon and Chilion integrated even more into Moabite society, and as young men, they looked for wives. Verse 4 tells us, they married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth, after they had lived there about 10 years. Mahlon married Ruth, a kind and hard-working young woman. Chilion chose Orpah, equally devoted. These Moabite women were welcomed into the family and learned much from Naomi about the ways of Israel. Though they came from a people who worshipped other gods, they respected the customs of their new family. The households lived in relative harmony. The daughters-in-law helped Naomi with daily chores, and everyone worked together to build a life in Moab. But the happiness didn't last. Both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband, says verse 5. Tragedy struck Naomi's house once again. First, she lost her husband, and now her 2 sons. We don't know exactly how they died, whether from illness or accident. The Bible doesn't say. We only know the grief hit this family hard. 3 women, all widows, sharing the same house and the same sorrow. For Naomi, it felt like her entire world had collapsed. She was in a foreign land with no husband, no sons, no grandchildren, only her 2 Moabite daughters-in-law who were also grieving their young husbands. The 3 women leaned on one another in mourning, but the future looked bleak. In a society where women depended on men to survive, 3 widows together faced an uncertain path. After the death of her sons, Naomi entered a time of darkness. The nights were long, and the mornings brought only memories of all she had lost. But then one day news arrived, news that brought a glimmer of hope. As Ruth 1:6 says, when Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. The famine in Israel had ended. God had remembered his people and blessed the land with abundant harvests once more. For Naomi, it felt like a calling. After nearly 10 years in Moab, she felt it was time to return home, to her land, her people. There was no reason to stay in a foreign place anymore. The decision wasn't easy. Moab had been her home for a long time. Her husband and sons were buried there. The land held memories, some sweet, some bitter. But Bethlehem was calling her back. There, she had relatives, friends from her youth, people who knew her before all the pain. Naomi packed up what little she had left. Years of hardship had taken nearly everything. Orpah and Ruth helped her gather what they could carry for the long journey ahead. The three women began walking the road back to Judah. But as they traveled, Naomi started thinking about the future of her daughters-in-law. They were young, beautiful, with their whole lives ahead of them. Why should they follow her, an old, bitter woman, to a land they didn't know? Along the way, Naomi stopped and turned to her daughters-in-law. With tears in her eyes, she spoke from the heart, as recorded in verses 8 and 9. Then Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness, as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Naomi was thinking about what was best for the young women. In Israel, they would be foreigners, Moabite women, viewed with suspicion. But in Moab, they were known, had family, and could start over, remarry, have children. So, with a mother's love, Naomi blessed them and kissed them goodbye, preparing to continue her journey alone. Then they wept aloud, says verse 9. The three women had shared so much joy, sorrow, grief. Saying goodbye was not easy. The bond between them ran deep, but Orpah and Ruth resisted the idea of leaving Naomi. "No," they said, "we will go back with you to your people," as verse 10 records. Naomi, however, insisted. She knew the chances of her daughters-in-law finding new husbands in Israel were slim to none. Verses 11 to 13 lay out her reasoning. But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters. It is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me." Naomi's words were harsh, but realistic. According to Israelite law, a man's brother was supposed to marry the widow to carry on the family line. But Naomi had no more sons to offer Orpah and Ruth. And even if she married again and had children, how long would they have to wait for those boys to grow up? It was a hopeless dream. Once again, the three women wept, feeling the pain of their looming separation, and then Orpah made her choice. At this, they wept aloud again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her, says verse 14. Orpah kissed Naomi goodbye through her tears. It wasn't an easy decision, but it was a practical one. She would return to her mother's house, just as Naomi had advised. She would go back to her people, her customs, her gods, and give herself a chance to start anew. Naomi didn't judge her. On the contrary, she used Orpah's choice to try one last time to convince Ruth. "Look," said Naomi, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her." Verse 15. It was Naomi's final attempt to release Ruth from a duty she felt was too heavy for someone so young. As Orpah faded into the distance on her way back to Moab, Ruth remained by Naomi's side. There was something special about this young Moabite woman, a quiet determination that went beyond the ordinary. Even with Naomi's repeated urging to turn back, Ruth did not waver. Then came a moment that would echo through the ages. Ruth looked into Naomi's eyes and spoke words that revealed the depth of her commitment, as recorded in Ruth 1:16-17. But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." Ruth's words weren't just poetic. They were a solemn vow, a declaration of loyalty that went far beyond typical family bonds. She wasn't merely choosing to stay with Naomi, she was choosing to give up everything she had known, her homeland, her people, her traditions, even the gods she grew up worshipping. "Your people will be my people, and your God, my God." This was more than duty or sympathy. Ruth had been touched by the faith of Naomi's family during the years they had lived together. She had seen something in Israel's God that the gods of Moab didn't offer, and now she was ready to fully embrace that new identity. Naomi was speechless in the face of such love and loyalty. Verse 18 tells us, when Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. There was nothing more to say. Ruth had made her choice, one that would shape both their destinies in ways they couldn't yet imagine. So, the two women, one older and bitter, the other young and steadfast, continued together down the dusty road to Bethlehem. The journey from Moab to Bethlehem was not easy. It was roughly 80 kilometers through rugged mountainous terrain and desert. For two women traveling alone, it was a hard and dangerous trip. Without male protection, they were vulnerable to robbers and other dangers on the road. They walked during the day, resting when the sun grew too hot. At night, they camped wherever they could, sharing the little food they had brought with them. Along the way, Naomi told stories about Bethlehem, what it was like before the famine, the people they might meet. Ruth listened closely, trying to picture what her new life would be like in this unfamiliar land. As they walked, Ruth must have thought about everything she was leaving behind. Her family, her friends, everything familiar. She was going to a place where she would be a foreigner, a Moabite in Israelite territory. Moabites were generally despised by the Israelites, considered descendants of an incestuous relationship and worshippers of idols. But still, Ruth pressed on. Her loyalty to Naomi was stronger than her fear of the unknown. And perhaps, deep in her heart, she felt this journey was more than just a change in location. It was a calling to something greater. Day by day, they drew closer to Judah. The landscape began to change. The hills of Moab gave way to the mountains of Judah. And finally, after many long days of travel, they saw Bethlehem in the distance. The small town of Bethlehem appeared on the horizon, nestled among rolling green hills. It was the beginning of spring, the time of the barley harvest. The fields surrounding the town were golden, ready to be reaped. For Naomi, it was a familiar sight, yet one filled with mixed emotions. This was her home, but she was returning as a different person than the one who had left. As Ruth 1:19 says, so the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them, and the women said, "Is this Naomi?" The arrival of the two women caused a stir in the small community. Bethlehem wasn't a large town. Everyone knew everyone. Many still remembered Naomi, the wife of Elimelech, who had left with her family during the famine nearly 10 years before. But now she returned alone, accompanied only by a young foreigner. Where were Elimelech and her sons? People stepped out of their homes, pointing and whispering, "Is that Naomi?" They asked one another, barely recognizing the older woman, stooped and worn down by grief, walking the streets of the city. Naomi heard the whispers and felt the weight of their stares. 10 years had passed, years filled with joy and sorrow, life and loss. She was no longer the Naomi who had once left Bethlehem, and she wanted everyone to know it. "Don't call me Naomi," she said, according to verse 20. "Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter." Naomi, which means pleasant or sweet, no longer felt her name suited her. Mara, meaning bitter, seemed a more fitting reflection of what she had become. She didn't hide her pain, nor her belief that God had dealt harshly with her. Continuing in verse 21, she poured her heart out. "I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." It was a raw and honest lament. When she left Bethlehem, she had a husband and 2 sons. She had hope, a future. Now she returned with none. Of that, only a foreign daughter-in-law by her side. In Naomi's mind, God had taken everything from her. The people of Bethlehem listened in silence, grasping the depth of her sorrow. Some of the older women who had known Naomi before came closer to offer comfort. There was sympathy in their eyes, perhaps even a tinge of guilt for not sharing. More when the famine had driven Naomi's family away. Meanwhile, Ruth stood quietly by Naomi's side, taking everything in with watchful eyes. These were the people she had chosen as her own. These streets would be her new home. She was a foreigner, and she could feel some wary glances, but she was determined to stand firm in her decision. Verse 22 closes the first chapter with, "So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab. And they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest." It seems like a simple detail, but it carries weight. They arrived at the start of the barley harvest, in spring, a time of renewal, of new life after winter. For many in Israel, it was also a time of celebration, marked by the feast of Passover. But for Naomi and Ruth, it was above all a time of uncertainty. As 2 widows without male protection, their future was fragile. In both Israelite and Moabite society, women depended on men, fathers, husbands, or sons for security. Without them, they were vulnerable. They needed a place to stay. Maybe Naomi still had some family property in Bethlehem, though it had likely been abandoned or taken over after so many years. In any case, they needed food, which meant they would have to work. Thankfully, Israelite law included provisions for the poor, widows, and foreigners. One of those laws was gleaning. Harvesters were instructed not to pick up the grain that fell during the harvest, leaving it instead for those in need. As Leviticus 23:22 says, "When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap your field right up to its edge, nor shall you gather the gleanings after your harvest. You shall leave them for the poor and for the sojourner." For Ruth and Naomi, this law would be a lifeline in the days ahead. The harvest was beginning, and with it, a chance not to go hungry. That first night in Bethlehem, as they settled into some humble corner, Ruth and Naomi must have talked about what they would do next. The young Moabite woman, used to hard work, likely volunteered to go to the fields. Naomi, familiar with her people's customs, probably explained how gleaning worked, and so ended their first day back in Bethlehem. Weary from the long journey, facing an uncertain future, yet somehow they were home. For Naomi, it was a bitter return to a place full of memories. For Ruth, it was the start of a new life in a foreign land, among a people she now called her. And the sun had barely risen when Ruth got up that morning. She looked at Naomi, still asleep, and decided not to wait any longer. They needed to eat, and the barley harvest was in full swing in the fields around Bethlehem. It was time to act. In Israel, there was a special law meant to help the poor, widows and foreigners. God had commanded in Leviticus 19:9-10, "When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap your field right up to its edge, neither shall you gather the gleanings after your harvest, and you shall not strip your vineyard bare, neither shall you gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and for the sojourner." This was the law of gleaning. Landowners were not to harvest every last grain. They were to leave the edges of their fields and anything that fell during the harvest for those in need. To gather, it was a way to ensure no one would go hungry, especially those who had no other means of support. Ruth knew of this tradition because she had heard about it from Naomi. Now she would have to put it into practice. She didn't want to be a burden to her mother-in-law. On the contrary, she wanted to take care of her. So she decided to take the initiative. "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor," Ruth said to Naomi, as recorded in Ruth 2:2. She was asking for permission, showing respect to her mother-in-law, but also showing determination. She wasn't going to sit idly by, waiting for food to fall from the sky. Naomi saw her daughter-in-law's resolve and agreed, "Go ahead, my daughter." Perhaps she gave her some guidance on where to go and how to behave, but in the end, she trusted Ruth's good judgment, and so, with an empty basket and hope in her heart, Ruth set out toward the fields. She didn't know anyone in Bethlehem. She didn't know exactly where to go. She simply followed where she saw other workers heading and chose a field where she could glean the leftovers. So she went out, entered a field, and began to glean. "Behind the harvesters," continues verse 3, "it was hard labor under the hot sun." Ruth bent down to pick up every bit of grain she could find, placing each one carefully into her basket. Her body ached, but she pressed on, thinking of Naomi and the food they needed. What Ruth didn't know at that moment was that out of all the fields in Bethlehem, she had entered the field of Boaz. As verse 3 continues, "As it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech." As it turned out is how the text describes it, but it would soon become clear that there was much more behind this so-called coincidence. Boaz wasn't just any landowner. He was a wealthy and influential man in Bethlehem, and more importantly, he was a relative of Elimelech, Naomi's deceased husband. He was a kinsman redeemer, someone who, under Israelite law, had responsibilities toward the family of a deceased relative. As Ruth worked, the other gleaners, and even some of the hired workers, began to notice the foreign woman. Her appearance, her way of speaking, everything about her made it obvious that she wasn't an Israelite. Some might have been hostile, others simply curious. But Ruth stayed focused on her task, respectful yet resolute. She worked tirelessly, picking up grain, one stalk at a time without rest. The other gleaners came and went, but Ruth had been there since early morning, without stopping, as Boaz's foreman would later point out. And then right on time, Boaz arrived at the field to check on the harvest. It was just an ordinary day for him, until his eyes landed on the unfamiliar young woman working so diligently among the gleaners. Boaz arrived from the town and greeted his workers with kind words. "The Lord be with you," he said. And they replied, "The Lord bless you," as recorded in Ruth 2:4. It was clear that Boaz was not just a boss, but a respected man who respected others, a man who feared God and honored him even in his daily greetings. As he oversaw the work, something, or rather someone, caught his attention. A young woman he didn't recognize was gleaning in his field. There was something different about her, about the way she worked, her perseverance. Curious, Boaz approached the harvest overseer. "Whose young woman is that?" he asked as we read in verse 5. It was a simple question, but it would set several lives on a new path. The overseer responded, explaining what he knew about the newcomer. She is the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi. She said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters." She came into the field and has remained here from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter. Verses 6 and 7. The overseer not only identified Ruth but also highlighted her work ethic. She had asked permission to glean, demonstrating respect for the landowner, and had been working hard since morning, with only a brief pause. That said a lot about her character. Boaz had already heard about Naomi's return to Bethlehem. He knew she was the widow of his relative Elimelech, and now here was the Moabite daughter-in-law he had also heard rumors about, the foreign woman who had chosen to leave her homeland to follow her elderly mother-in-law. Moved by compassion and admiration, Boaz decided to speak to Ruth himself. He approached her with respect and kindness, treating her not as a stranger or someone beneath him, but as someone worthy of care and attention. "Listen, my daughter," he said to Ruth, as we see in verse 8. "Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me." Boaz not only allowed her to glean in his field, he explicitly invited her to stay, offering her protection and the special privilege of staying close to his female workers. And he continued in verse 9. "Watch the field where the men are harvesting, and follow along after the women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you, and whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled." Boaz wasn't just giving her permission, he was actively ensuring her safety. He had instructed his men not to bother Ruth, a crucial protection for a foreign woman in a field full of male workers. And beyond that, he offered her access to water drawn by his own servants, an important comfort during long hours under the scorching sun. Ruth was stunned by such unexpected kindness. As a foreigner, she expected mere tolerance, certainly not favor. Following the custom of the time, she bowed down with her face to the ground and asked him, "Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" Verse 10. It was an honest question. Why would he, a man of standing in Israel, show such kindness to her, a Moabite? The Moabites were traditionally enemies of Israel. Why should she deserve such treatment? Boaz's response revealed that his kindness was not random. It was a reaction to Ruth's own character and actions. As we read in verses 11 and 12, Boaz replied, "I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with the people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Boaz wasn't just impressed by Ruth's presence in his field that day. He had heard the whole story. Her loyalty to Naomi, her willingness to leave everything behind, her choice to seek refuge under the wings of Israel's God. All of it pointed to an extraordinary character, and Boaz acknowledged that. Touched by such kind words, Ruth responded, "With humility, may I continue to find favor in your eyes, my lord," she said. "You have put me at ease by speaking kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servants." Verse 13. She understood the honor she was receiving, greater than she believed she deserved. The conversation could have ended there, but Boaz's generosity had no limits that day. At mealtime, he invited her to join the workers. As we read in verse 14, at mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come over here, have some bread and dip it in the wine vinegar." When she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted and had some left over. This was no ordinary invitation for a gleaner, especially a foreigner. But Boaz was determined to show kindness to this woman who had shown such kindness to Naomi. Not only did he invite her to eat, he made sure she had an abundant portion, so much that she had leftovers. And Boaz's generosity didn't stop after the meal. When Ruth went back to work, he gave special instructions to his workers. As we see in verses 15 and 16, as she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men, "Let her gather among the sheaves and don't reprimand her. Even pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up, and don't rebuke her." This went far beyond the gleaning laws. Boaz was telling his workers to intentionally leave extra grain for Ruth to gather. It was a calculated act of generosity, making sure she had more than enough without humiliating her with obvious charity. She would still work for what she gathered, preserving her dignity, but her reward would be far greater thanks to Boaz's quiet instructions. And so Ruth worked until evening, gleaning in Boaz's field. When she finally stopped to thresh what she had gathered, the result was impressive. It amounted to about an ephah of barley, verse 17 says. That was a significant amount, enough to feed Ruth and Naomi for several days, much more than any ordinary gleaner could expect in a day's work. With this precious treasure, Ruth returned to the city, eager to share not only the food she had collected, but also the story of the extraordinary day she had just experienced. When Ruth came home carrying her sack of barley, Naomi could hardly believe how much she had gathered. "Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." Ruth 2:19. It wasn't normal for a gleaner to collect so much in one day. Naomi realized that someone had clearly shown Ruth special favor. Ruth then told the full story, her work in the field, the encounter with Boaz, and the kindness he had shown. "The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz," she said, not realizing the weight that name would carry for Naomi. Naomi's face lit up with renewed hope. "The Lord bless him," Naomi exclaimed in verse 20. "He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead." Then she revealed something Ruth didn't know. "That man is our close relative. He is one of our guardian redeemers." Naomi saw something Ruth, as a foreigner, wouldn't fully grasp. Boaz wasn't just a kind man who had helped a widow in need. He was a goal, a kinsman redeemer, someone who, under Israelite law, had the right and even the duty to redeem a deceased relative's family. Mosaic law provided that when an Israelite man died without children, his brother or nearest relative should marry the widow and give her a child who would carry on the name and inheritance of the deceased. This is known as the Levirate law, found in Deuteronomy 25:5-6. If brothers are living together and one of them dies without a son, his widow must not marry outside the family. Her husband's brother shall take her and marry her and fulfill the duty of a brother-in-law to her. The first son she bears shall carry on the name of the dead brother so that his name will not be blotted out from Israel. In addition, the goal also had the responsibility of redeeming any family land that had been sold due to poverty, as outlined in Leviticus 25:25. If one of your fellow Israelites becomes poor and sells some of their property, their nearest relative is to come and redeem what they have sold. Naomi saw in Boaz a hope not only for immediate provision, but for their future. As a close relative of Elimelech, Boaz could serve as a goal, marrying Ruth to preserve the family line and possibly even redeeming any family property that had been lost. Encouraged by this revelation, Ruth shared more of Boaz's words. "He even said to me, 'Stay with my workers until they finish harvesting all my grain.'" Verse 21. He had offered ongoing protection, not just for a day, but for the entire harvest season. Naomi saw in this a divine opportunity and encouraged Ruth to accept it. "It is good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, so that you are not found in another field." Verse 22. It was safer and wiser for Ruth to remain in Boaz's field, where she was protected and favored, rather than risk herself among strangers elsewhere. So following Naomi's counsel, Ruth stayed close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvests, and she lived with her mother-in-law, verse 23. For weeks, Ruth worked in Boaz's fields, always under his protection, always returning home with enough food for herself and Naomi. It was a season of stability and security after so much hardship. But as the harvest came to an end, Naomi knew they had to start thinking long-term. Gleaning was a temporary solution. What would happen when there was no more harvest? How would two widows survive the winter without a provider? That's when Naomi, inspired by the divine providence that had already brought Ruth to Boaz's field, began to formulate a plan, an audacious plan that, if successful, could secure a permanent future for them both. In Ruth 3:1-4, we see Naomi explaining the plan to Ruth. "My daughter, should I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you? Is not Boaz, with whose young women you were, our relative? See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Wash therefore and anoint yourself, and put on your cloak and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. But when he lies down, observe the place where he lies. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do." Naomi's plan was risky and could easily be misunderstood. She was instructing Ruth to approach Boaz in an intimate setting, the threshing floor at night, after he had eaten and drunk, when he would be alone. To an outside observer, this encounter might seem inappropriate, even scandalous. But Naomi knew Boaz. She knew his character, his integrity, his kindness, and she knew the law of Israel. By instructing Ruth to uncover Boaz's feet and lie down, Naomi was essentially guiding her to present herself as eligible for marriage under the Levirate law. It was a symbolic gesture, a quiet reminder to Boaz of his role as kinsman redeemer. Ruth, trusting Naomi's wisdom and the kindness she had already seen in Boaz, agreed. "All that you say, I will do," she replied in verse 5. It was an act of faith and trust, both in Naomi and in Boaz, and ultimately in the God of Israel, under whose wings she had come to seek refuge. So, with the plan set, Ruth prepared for an encounter that could change her life forever. The harvest was over, and it was a time of celebration. Boaz, as the landowner, was overseeing the final stage, the winnowing of barley at the threshing floor. It was a joyful moment, one of abundance after weeks of hard work. In Ruth 3:7 we read, "When Boaz had eaten and drunk, and his heart was merry, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. Then she came softly and uncovered his feet and lay down." Boaz was not drunk, just content after a good meal, celebrating the successful end of the harvest. The threshing floor was typically an open space on a hilltop, where grain was separated from chaff by the wind. During this time, it was common for landowners to sleep nearby to guard the freshly processed grain from theft. Boaz, following custom, prepared to spend the night beside his harvest. Ruth followed Naomi's instructions to the letter. She had washed, anointed herself, and put on her best clothes. She waited until everyone had fallen asleep and Boaz had laid down. Then quietly, she came softly, approached Boaz, uncovered his feet and lay down. This was not a seductive act, as modern eyes might misread it. It was a formal request, a silent reminder to Boaz of his role as redeemer. By uncovering his feet, Ruth was symbolically asking him to extend his protection over her, to spread the corner of your garment over me, a Hebrew expression tied to marriage and covenant. Sometime in the night, Boaz stirred, perhaps from the chill of his uncovered feet or the movement of Ruth nearby. At midnight, the man was startled and turned over, and behold, a woman lay at his feet, says verse 8. Imagine Boaz's surprise, waking up in the dark to find someone there. "Who are you?" he asked in verse 9. In the darkness, he couldn't see clearly. Ruth answered plainly, I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer. Her response was both an identification and a proposal. Spread your wings over your servant was a poetic way of saying, marry me. And she made her reason clear, for you are a redeemer. She wasn't appealing to Boaz's emotions, but to his role and responsibility under the law as a close relative. It was a situation ripe for misinterpretation. A young woman at night approaching a man as he slept, it could have seemed improper. But Boaz understood exactly what Ruth was doing. He saw the honor, the courage, the purity in her request. Boaz's response in verses 10-11 reveals his integrity and deep respect for Ruth. May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, in that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask, for all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman. Boaz didn't see Ruth's request as presumptuous or scandalous, but as a beautiful act of loyalty, both to Naomi and to the memory of Ruth's late husband. He praised her for not chasing after younger men, whether wealthy or not, but for honoring the law of Israel and seeking the kinsman redeemer. And he affirmed her virtue before all the people of my town know that you are a woman of noble character. But there was a complication. Boaz, a man of integrity who respected the law, revealed to Ruth, it is true that I am a guardian redeemer of your family, but there is another who is more closely related than I. Verse 12. According to Israelite law, the duty of redeeming, marrying the widow and preserving the family line first fell to the closest relative. Boaz couldn't simply bypass this other relative's rights. He had to follow the proper legal process, ensuring that everything was done decently and in order, as the Apostle Paul would later put it. So Boaz assured Ruth that he would take care of the matter the very next morning. Stay here for the night, and in the morning, if he wants to do his duty as your guardian redeemer, good, let him redeem you. But if he is not willing, as surely as the Lord lives, I will do it. Lie here until morning. Verses 13-14. Ruth trusted Boaz and stayed at his feet until dawn. But Boaz, concerned about Ruth's reputation, made sure she left before anyone could see her. She got up before anyone could be recognized, and he said, no one must know that a woman came to the threshing floor. Verse 14. Before she left, Boaz offered her another act of generosity. Bring me the shawl you are wearing, and hold it out. When she did so, he poured into it 6 measures of barley and placed it on her. Verse 15. It was a generous gift, yet another sign of his commitment to care for Ruth and Naomi, regardless of the outcome of his discussion with the other redeemer. So, Ruth returned home not just with a tangible gift from Boaz, but with the promise that he would personally take charge of her situation. The encounter at the threshing floor, risky as it had been, was a success. Now everything hinged on how Boaz would deal with the other guardian redeemer. Early the next morning, Boaz went to the town gate. This wasn't just a place people passed through. It was the center of public life in Bethlehem, where business, legal decisions, and social meetings took place. It was the right place to handle legal matters like the one Boaz had in mind. In Ruth 4:1-2 we read, meanwhile Boaz went up to the town gate and sat down there just as the guardian redeemer he had mentioned came along. Boaz said, come, over here, my friend, and sit down. So he went over and sat down. Boaz took 10 of the elders of the town and said, sit here, and they did so. Boaz didn't refer to the other relative by name, simply calling him friend. This wasn't out of disrespect, but possibly because, as we'll see, the man would not fulfill his role as redeemer, and so his name was not deemed worthy of remembrance. Boaz gathered 10 of the town's elders to witness the transaction. The number was significant. It ensured everything would be done legally with reputable witnesses. Boaz was committed to following every proper step so that his union with Ruth would be lawful and above question. Once everyone was gathered, Boaz presented the matter to the closer relative. Naomi, who has come back from Moab, is selling the fair piece of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. I thought I should bring the matter to your attention and suggest that you buy it in the presence of these seated here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, do so, but if you will not, tell me, so I will know. For no one has the right to do it except you, and I am next in line. Verses 3-4. Boaz initially mentioned only the land that had belonged to Elimelech. According to Israelite law, when a family was forced to sell land due to poverty, a close relative had the right, and even the duty, to redeem or repurchase it, keeping it within the family. This was part of the responsibility of the goal, the family redeemer. Seeing a chance to expand his property, the relative quickly replied, "I will redeem it." Verse 4. He seemed willing to fulfill his duty, at least regarding the land. But then Boaz revealed the added condition the part he had deliberately saved for last. On the day you buy the land from Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the dead man's widow, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property. Verse 5, this was the true test. Boaz clarified that with the land came the obligation to marry Ruth in order to raise up the name of the deceased upon his inheritance. This meant that any son born from that union would legally carry the name and inheritance of Ruth's late husband, Mahlon, not the name of the new husband. The land the Redeemer bought would eventually go to that child, not to his own heirs. That changed everything for the other man. What had seemed like a good investment, adding land to his estate, suddenly became a costly obligation. He would have to spend his resources on property that would ultimately benefit someone else's lineage. His response was straightforward. "Then I cannot redeem it because I might endanger my own estate. You redeem it yourself, I cannot do it." Verse 6. He chose to step aside and let Boaz take on the responsibility, to confirm the transaction publicly, in line with the customs of the time. Now, in earlier times in Israel, for the redemption and transfer of property to become final, one party took off his sandal and gave it to the other. This was the method of legalizing transactions in Israel. Verse 7. So the guardian redeemer removed his sandal and gave it to Boaz, saying, "Buy it yourself." Verse 8. It was a symbolic gesture officially transferring the right of redemption to Boaz. With the way now clear, Boaz addressed the elders and all the people gathered there. "Today you are witnesses that I have bought from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Chilion, and Mahlon. I have also acquired Ruth the Moabite, Mahlon's widow, as my wife, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property, so that his name will not disappear from among his family or from his hometown. Today you are witnesses." Verses 9-10. Boaz was not merely settling a legal matter, he was making a public declaration of his commitment to Ruth and to preserving her family's legacy. He was honoring not just the letter of the law, but its spirit, ensuring that Mahlon's name would continue through his widow. The response of the elders and the people was enthusiastic and full of blessing. In verses 11-12 they said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you prosper in Ephrathah and be famous in Bethlehem. Through the offspring the Lord gives you by this young woman, may your family be like that of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah." They compared Ruth to Rachel and Leah, Israel's matriarchs and Jacob's wives, who gave birth to the sons that became the 12 tribes of Israel. This was a profound honor, recognizing Ruth not as a foreigner, but as someone worthy to be counted among the founding mothers of the nation. They also mentioned Tamar and Perez, recalling another story where a family line was preserved under unusual circumstances. Tamar, a widow who was denied her rights under Levirate law, eventually conceived by Judah, her father-in-law, and gave birth to Perez, an important ancestor in the tribe of Judah. The negotiation at the city gate concluded with great acclaim. The way was now clear for Boaz and Ruth to marry, legally and with the blessing of the entire community. What had begun as a simple act of gleaning in a field had, through divine providence, turned into a union that would be remembered for generations. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife, says Ruth 4:13. The text records the marriage simply and humbly, sealing Boaz and Ruth's destiny. We're given no details about the ceremony itself, but it's clear that it took place with full recognition and approval from the community, following the legal process at the city gate. Boaz, a respected and prosperous man of Bethlehem, and Ruth, the Moabite outsider who had shown such loyalty and virtue, were now joined. It was an unlikely union, one that, unbeknownst to them at the time, would play a crucial role in the story of Israel, and eventually the world. And he made love to her, and the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son, the verse continues. A special blessing rested on this marriage, Ruth's pregnancy. For a woman who had been married to Mahlon for years without bearing children, the Bible doesn't explicitly mention infertility, but it's implied since she had no children when Mahlon died. This conception was especially significant. When the baby was born, the celebration wasn't only for Boaz and Ruth, but especially for Naomi. The women of the town came to congratulate her, saying, "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth." Verses 14-15. Notice that although the baby was the son of Ruth and Boaz, the women congratulated Naomi. This reflects the cultural understanding that the child born through levirate marriage was, in a sense, considered the child of the deceased, continuing his lineage. For Naomi, who had lost her husband and sons, this baby represented the restoration of her family. The women also recognized Ruth's extraordinary value, saying she was better than 7 sons. In a society where sons, especially many sons, were seen as the greatest blessing, this was an incredible compliment. Ruth, through her loyalty and love, had brought more blessing to Naomi than many sons could have. Then Naomi took the child in her arms and cared for him, says verse 16. Naomi not only celebrated her grandson's birth, but took an active role in his upbringing. Holding him in her lap was a symbolic gesture of adoption, affirming that this child would truly carry on her son Mahlon's line. The women living there said, "Naomi has a son," and they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Verse 17. The name Obed means servant or worshipper, possibly reflecting the hope that he would be a faithful servant of the Lord. Interestingly, it was the neighbors who named the child, emphasizing the communal nature of the event. The entire neighborhood shared in the joy and recognized the significance of this birth. Verse 17 also foreshadows this baby's future importance. Obed would become the grandfather of King David. What began as a story of loss and despair had become a vital link in Israel's history. For Ruth and Boaz, the birth of Obed marked the fulfillment of their unexpected but blessed union. For Naomi, it was the restoration of hope and joy after years of bitterness. And for the community of Bethlehem, it was a testimony to God's goodness, turning mourning into dancing and restoring what once seemed hopelessly lost. The book of Ruth ends with what might seem surprising: a genealogy. The final verses, Ruth 4:18-22, trace the lineage from Perez, son of Judah, down to David, highlighting Obed's place in that line. This then is the family line of Perez. Perez was the father of Hezron, Hezron the father of Ram, Ram the father of Amminadab, Amminadab the father of Nahshon, Nahshon the father of Salmon, Salmon the father of Boaz, Boaz the father of Obed, Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David. This genealogy isn't just a technical appendix at the end of a beautiful story. It's the key to understanding the broader significance of the book of Ruth within the grand biblical narrative. It reveals that the seemingly simple story of a Moabite widow and her Israelite mother-in-law was in fact a crucial link in the chain leading to Israel's greatest king, David, and ultimately to the Messiah. Jesus Obed, the son of Ruth and Boaz, became the father of Jesse. And Jesse, as all Israelites knew, was the father of David, the greatest king of Israel, the man after God's own heart. Thus Ruth, a foreign Moabite woman, became the great-grandmother of King David, included in Israel's royal lineage. This revelation becomes even more astonishing when we recall that the Moabites were generally despised by the Israelites. They were descendants of Moab, the child born from the incestuous relationship between Lot and his eldest daughter, as recorded in Genesis 19:37. The Mosaic law had laid out strict prohibitions regarding the Moabites. No Ammonite or Moabite may enter the assembly of the Lord. Even to the 10th generation, none of them may ever enter the assembly of the Lord. Deuteronomy 23:3. And yet, here was Ruth, not only accepted into the community of Israel, but honored as an ancestor of King David. It's a powerful testament that faithfulness to God and his people can transcend ethnic boundaries and historical prejudices. Later, when the Gospel of Matthew records the genealogy of Jesus Christ, Ruth is explicitly mentioned. Boaz was the father of Obed by Ruth, Obed the father of Jesse, Matthew 1:5. She is one of only 5 women named in Jesus' genealogy, highlighting her extraordinary significance in the story of redemption. Ruth's inclusion in the Messiah's lineage underscores several crucial truths: that God often works through the unlikely and the marginalized, that true faith, not ethnic heritage, determines who belongs to God's people, and that human history, with all its tragedies and triumphs, is guided by a providential God who weaves everything together to fulfill his greater purposes. The story of Ruth isn't just a historical account or a beautiful narrative. It's filled with deep spiritual lessons that have echoed through the ages. First, we see how God can use unlikely people for his purposes. Ruth was a foreigner, a Moabite, traditionally excluded from Israel's assembly. She had no status, no wealth, no power. And yet, God used her as a critical link in the lineage that would lead to the Messiah, as 1 Corinthians 1:27-28 says, "But God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. God chose the lowly things of this world and the despised things, and the things that are not, to nullify the things that are." Ruth's inclusion in Jesus' lineage emphasizes that God's plan of salvation was always meant to include all nations, not just Israel. As God promised Abraham, "Through you all the families of the earth will be blessed." Genesis 12:3. Through Ruth, a Moabite, became part of Jesus' genealogy, foreshadowing the time when people from every nation, tribe, people, and language, Revelation 7:9, would stand before God's throne. The story also presents a powerful parallel between Boaz's role as a kinsman redeemer and the role of Jesus Christ as our Redeemer. Just as Boaz paid a price to redeem Elimelech's inheritance and marry Ruth, Jesus paid the ultimate price to redeem us from sin and bring us into a covenant relationship with himself. As Paul writes in Ephesians 1:7, "In him we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of sins, in accordance with the riches of God's grace." Boaz was a close relative with the right to redeem. Similarly, Jesus, through his incarnation, became our human brother, able to represent us and redeem us. As Hebrews 2:11 says, both the one who makes people holy and those who are made holy are of the same family. So Jesus is not ashamed to call them brothers and sisters. Divine providence is another central theme in Ruth's story. Ruth just so happened to choose Boaz's field to glean in, just so happened to arrive in Bethlehem at the start of the harvest, just so happened to encounter Boaz at the threshing floor, and the other relative just so happened to decline his right to redeem. All of these coincidences point to God's invisible hand guiding the events to fulfill his purpose. As Proverbs 16:9 puts it, the heart of man plans his way, but the Lord establishes his steps. Finally, the story shows how small acts of faithfulness can have eternal impact. When Ruth declared, "Your people will be my people and your God will be my God," she couldn't have known that this decision would place her in the lineage of the Messiah. Her choice to remain loyal to Naomi and to the God of Israel had consequences she could never have foreseen. In the same way, our seemingly small daily decisions to be faithful, though they may appear insignificant, can carry weight far beyond what we can imagine. As Jesus said in Luke 16:10, "Whoever is faithful with very little will also be faithful with much, and whoever is dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with much." Ruth's story vividly illustrates what the Apostle Paul would write centuries later, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. Romans 8:28. Through loss, grief, poverty, and hardship, God was weaving a story of redemption, not only to bless Ruth, Boaz, and Naomi in their time, but one that would ripple through King David and ultimately to Jesus Christ, bringing blessing to the entire world. If this story touched your heart today, don't keep it to yourself. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that God is working behind the scenes in our lives. Maybe it's a friend going through a hard time, or a family member who needs to hear again about God's faithfulness. If you're not yet subscribed to the channel, this is the perfect moment to join our family. Hit that subscribe button now so you don't miss any of our Bible stories, and most importantly, turn on the notification bell so you'll be alerted every time we post a new video. What did you think of Ruth's story? Which part moved you the most? Tell us in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. Your voice matters. And don't forget to like this video so it can reach more people with this beautiful message of hope and redemption. See you in the next video, where we'll keep exploring the wonderful stories of the Bible and their connection to the coming of Jesus Christ.